Hey, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to talk about Sherlock Holmes. And the reason I want to do that is one, it's my channel. I can do whatever I want. Two, I recently finished the second volume of this very nice set of Barnes& Noble's classics of The Complete Sherlock Holmes. And I had previously read the first volume, and I have thoughts. I have opinions. First off, I will say that when I was much younger, I read some of the Sherlock Holmes stuff and really enjoyed it. I had always meant to kind of go back and read maybe not all the stories by Conan Doyle, but most of them. And I think Sherlock Holmes has been turned into a character in a bunch of different other things out there. But Conan Doyle is the original source for it, and for better or worse, he kind of set the template for what Sherlock Holmes could be and could not be in the public imagination. And I think it's worth going back to the source in this sense. And, you know, obviously, Sherlock Holmes is probably the most famous fictional detective, but he wasn't the first. I think most scholars and critics, and even Conan Doyle himself, would agree that the first real modern detective in the genre was, and this is where my high school French comes in handy. C. Auguste Dupin, a creation of Edgar Allan Poe, and I believe Dupin appears in 3 stories, at least, that I'm familiar with. Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Case of Marie Roget, and The Purloined Letter. And I think Dupin is at his strongest in the first one, the Rue Morgue story. Uh, I've read all 3 of those, and I think Marie Roget is probably the weakest, kind of the weirdest. It's based on a real incident. And I think Poe was trying to solve the real incident in the format of his short story. Uh, it just wasn't my thing. So, but with Sherlock Holmes, it's more fanciful. It's less like Arthur Conan Doyle. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote these stories. He wrote the first novel, A Study in Scarlet, 1887, I want to say, 1880s, certainly at the tail end of the Victorian era. And from the 2 novels that he started off with, Sign of Four and, or excuse me, A Study in Scarlet, and then The Sign of Four, he went and started writing these stories where Sherlock Holmes and his assistant, Dr. John Watson, who is also the chronicler of what all happens to Holmes during his investigations and such. He started writing those in the 1890s, and he got burnt out on writing Holmes. And so, in a very famous story, like, had Holmes being killed off by his nemesis, Professor Moriarty, which more about that later. And then the public was like, no, no, we want Sherlock Holmes to come back from the dead. And so Conan Doyle pulled basically the somehow Palpatine return meme well over a century before that became a thing, and had Sherlock Holmes return. And I understand that, but I would argue that the stories in the first volume, uh, before he kills off Holmes, are a lot stronger than the stories in the second volume. I'm glad that they both exist, I want to say, because Sherlock Holmes, as a character anyway, in the short stories, is very compelling. And his interplay with Watson, the way that Watson is always like 2 steps behind Holmes and sort of like assumes the best of anyone who looks like a Victorian era gentleman or gentlewoman, even though they could easily be a criminal, it's kind of amusing. I almost wonder sometimes, and other people can, you know comment on this and tell me if Watson is supposed to be this dumb, or if, like, did Conan Doyle set him up to be almost a comic figure in a way, or is Watson the reflection of Conan Doyle? You know, I'm not sure, but I find the whole interplay between them enjoyable. I think for me, the novels, as Conan Doyle wrote them, don't really work as well as the stories. Like, at least of the four, there are four novels. There's A Study in Scarlet, Sign of Four, Hound of the Baskervilles, and then The Valley of Fear. And I think Hound of the Baskervilles is about the only one that really works overall. Uh, the other ones have really long interludes of like flashback. And especially by the time you get to Valley of Fear, it's like, oh, good, another extended flashback. Yay. And also, I'm gonna guess that Conan Doyle really wanted to write westerns, maybe, because uh, A Study in Scarlet, I believe, is also the one with the Mormon interlude, the Utah interlude, set in the Old West. Very convincing dialogue, very convincing. Wink. Same thing with the Valley of Fear. It's set in California, and just, I've never read the original novel Dracula by Bram Stoker, but I understand there's an American character in there where everyone who's read the novel says, like, yeah, he has no idea what actual Americans sound like. And I would say that Conan Doyle has no idea what Americans in the 1800s actually sounded like. Um, but that doesn't mean that they're not entertaining. Like, it's almost like in a Mystery Science Theater 3000 kind of way, reading the novels and being like, oh yeah, that checks out. Um, so I wouldn't like. I mean, if you want to read the novels, by all means. Hound of Baskervilles to me is the one that works the most, even though I'm not sure that Conan Doyle stuck the landing, as it were, because that's the one that's most steeped in sort of supernatural stuff and whatnot. But by and large, I think the stories are really the meat and potatoes of the Sherlock Holmes legend. And of course, Sherlock is this very, I guess the 2024 term for it would be antisocial or socially awkward. He's a very compelling protagonist. And, obviously, I don't need to tell you that, numerous properties over the years have been made of Sherlock Holmes, kind of either expanding on the stories or taking the stories. Like, hot take, if you will, I actually really enjoyed the two Robert Downey Jr. Sherlock Holmes films. Yeah, I know. I don't mind, honestly, that in those films he's more of an action hero than necessarily a detective. I think both those stories are structured around Sherlock Holmes's strengths, and I just enjoyed them a lot. So I do think the quality of the stories drops off after because Conan Doyle like killed off Holmes, and then was like, the public outcry was such that he had to bring it back, and it was like, I think the quality of the stories post resurrection, if you will, are not quite as good. But overall, like, I'm glad that they exist. I'm glad that we have all this stuff. And another thing that I think is kind of interesting to consider is, it Holmes sees Professor Moriarty as his nemesis, and you could argue that, yeah, he definitely is like this, is smart enough to be Holmes's enemy and such. I kind of wonder, like, when I was reading through like the stories where Holmes is like blaming Moriarty for the turnout of everything, or not, the end of the stories, being like, oh, surely this is the work of Moriarty. I'm like, Um, is it though? You know, it's kind of. I feel sometimes like there's a certain amount of like tinfoil hat wearing on Holmes's part whenever he's blaming Moriarty for various things that occur either in the story or throughout London and whatever. Um, is it all in Holmes's head? Is he making this up as he goes? Like, does he need a nemesis as smart as him to, because a lot of the stories focus on the fact that in the time in between when Holmes is not on a case, he is bored to tears. He's either playing a violin, he's shooting off a gun. In the early novels, he is very much addicted to drugs. So, you know, it's that late Victorian, London is the center of the world and all eyes are on London. And so, you know, if he's not in the middle of something, he is bored and, he's not using his detective skills for anything good. Like it's kind of interesting to sort of think about. I know there is a novel and movie that sort of has Sherlock being treated by, I think, Sigmund Freud, the 7% solution. If I can find a copy of that book, I would definitely want to read it. But I think Holmes he's very flawed, is really the main takeaway. And he's easily prone to his demons in a way that I don't know that this is necessarily on purpose, but I think a lot of the sort of film noir or, you know, hard boiled mysteries kind of things, like a lot of the detectives in those are prone to demons as well. Drink, or, women who may or may not have the protagonist's best interest in heart, you know. And I think it's interesting that Holmes, one, doesn't really have a female presence in his life other than like the maid or the housekeeper in his house. Like he and Watson have a living arrangement, and then Watson falls in love and marries and moves out. And then in the interim between Holmes dying out and then being brought back, Watson's wife, conveniently off stage, dies, and so Watson can move back in with Holmes and pursue their lifestyle of hunting down criminals and solving cases, and basically making London safe or something like that. And I think a lot of what you see in detective fiction these days obviously owes a huge debt to Sherlock Holmes and to Conan Doyle. I don't think that the novels themselves are quite worthy of that esteem. The short stories really are the meat and potatoes, as I said. And you can't go wrong with them. Even the weakest stories in these volumes, and there are some that kind of like, it's like, that's the solution? Really? Even those work in a way that I think could inspire, other writers, other creative people to, see what they can do with it. And I love the fact that, again, there is so much media out there that uses Sherlock Holmes, either reverently or satirically, or, just he's an easy archetype to understand. He's focused on the job, he's focused on solving the cases, and then when he gets done, he plays his violin, or in the early books, he does a little toot, and then it's back to boredom until another case comes along, and it's fun sometimes to go back and read the origin of a genre, the origin of a archetype, a a beginning story, as it were. Not always. I think there was a book. I'm blanking on it right now. Obviously, whenever I'm trying to do a video about these things, but it's sometimes it's nice to go back and read the first piece of literature out there that is in that vein. And then sometimes it's like, oh, Treasure Island. Yes, I remembered it. Yay. Yeah, Treasure Island. I read. This is a tangent, but I read Treasure Island earlier this year, and of course, all the pirate stories are kind of inspired by that and whatnot. And it was all right. It wasn't anything like it definitely inspired a lot of better versions of the story than it itself is. I think you don't really have that issue with the Sherlock Holmes stories from Conan Doyle in that most of them hold up very well. Again, the novels, I mean, go ahead and read them if you're going to read Sherlock Holmes because there's stuff in there, but I think the main takeaway that I got from them is that Conan Doyle has no idea what to do with Sherlock Holmes outside the context of like a very short story. I think, and he knows that. I'll give him credit for that. I think the interludes where Holmes and Watson aren't even in the story anymore, it makes sense. I'm not. I think if someone had told me like this is a novel where Sherlock Holmes is on every page, and then I read it and like especially in the Mormon section of Studying Scarlet or the California section of Valley of Fear, I'd be like, where is Holmes? Where's Watson? Uh, but I think overall they're worth reading. And again, I think Hound of the Baskervilles is probably the best of the four novels that Conan Doyle wrote. But best is like a qualifier. Not much of a qualifier, really. But anyway, those are my thoughts on Sherlock Holmes. And I will do a video this weekend, sort of summing up my reading for September, if you are interested. And to people out there who are watching this who have been affected by the hurricane recently, like myself, uh, stay safe, and I hope your power gets restored. And just keep reading.